The latent heat from the fires throughout Kudin was still hanging in the air, but even still it was starting to get progressively cooler as the day wore on. It was borderline impossible to gauge the actual time. Neither Hector nor Ellie had a working phone or a watch, and the sky was still largely obscured by clouds of smoke and ash. It was difficult to pinpoint the exact time. At the very least, though, they had noticed that it was getting darker. Hector's joints were starting to ache. He wasn't in bad shape, but anyone would be sore after that much walking in the aftermath of being thrown across a parking lot by a huge explosion. Despite being the one to suggest they would possibly have to find somewhere to sleep, a part of Hector had been hoping they would reach the hospital before it got too dark. At that point, it was now sinking in just how big a city and its surrounding suburbs really were. There was no way they were going to make it to the hospital before night obscured Kudin in a curtain of total blackness. While there were some streetlights that seemed at least partially functional, they couldn't count on them to stay that way. She wouldn't say it, but Hector knew it was even worse for Ellie. There were still times where her legs started to fail her and she needed his support to walk. The medicine was helping her nausea, but it was wearing off far faster than Hector had hoped or expected. Ellie had already taken 2 more of the wafers since the first he had given her back at the house, yet she still ended up heaving and retching. Of course, those times would often be what triggered her losing strength in her legs. Compared to what Ellie was struggling with, Hector knew he was doing okay. Even still, the pain from the exertion was starting to get to him. What was more, his own milder bouts of nausea were now being compounded by hunger pangs. Hector couldn't remember the last time he had gone without a full meal in a day. Unfortunately, he hadn't really been able to scrabble up any more edible food since the bananas he'd dug up. He had split one with Ellie already, and he didn't want to risk eating their only other food before day 1 was even over. It was becoming difficult not to complain. The only reason he didn't was because Ellie wasn't. Hector was continually amazed by her mental fortitude. Outside of their first encounter, she had proven to be consistently even-tempered regardless of the obstacles they faced. Meanwhile, he could feel his temper fraying. The sudden rumbling of thunder in the distance did not improve his mood. In fact, both he and Ellie nearly jumped out of their skin when they heard it, half expecting a second explosion. There hadn't been any rain yet, but the repeated claps of thunder suggested there would soon be a heavy downpour. They weren't exactly short of options for shelter, at least. They were passing through a part commercial, part industrial area. While none of the buildings around them were completely unharmed, there weren't that many that had been leveled either. At worst, the structures would only be partially collapsed and were still standing, more or less. Despite this, though, they hadn't encountered any other people. This area wasn't hit nearly as bad as the last. Nobody's here, though. I wonder why, Hector said. Anyone who could have evacuated probably did, or rushed to check on their family and friends, Ellie said. I figure most phones stopped working like ours did. That made sense to Hector. I doubt we're going to see anyone else until we get somewhere people are gathering then. Probably, Ellie agreed, starting to continue forwards. As she walked, though, she stumbled. She caught herself, but Hector didn't miss it. He would have to support her again if they were to keep moving. His joints were screaming at him, though. He did not relish the idea of carrying part of her weight again. Could he really call for a break when, despite her trembling limbs, Ellie was still trying to push forward? In the end, self-preservation won over his pride. Wait, let's take a break. Shouldn't we try to cover more ground before it gets too dark? Ellie asked. If you weren't barely able to stand, maybe, Hector said. But you're nearly falling over again and my joints are killing me. I don't think I can hold you and myself up for another couple of hours without falling apart. Realizing that he would struggle to continue was enough of a blow to Hector's ego, but actually voicing that to Ellie left him awash with shame. Logically, he knew that he was making the practical decision, but her resolve to keep going despite her difficulties was so strong that he felt he should have been able to match it. Ellie took a breath and sighed, slowly moving to the side of the road and sitting down. I guess you're right. Hector joined her a moment later. I'd like to keep going, but neither of us are up for it without some rest. We'll just sit for 20 minutes or so. Thunder rumbled again, a deafening roar in the sky above them. It wouldn't be long now before they were drenched too. They would have to take shelter eventually, but Hector hoped they could make it a decent amount further first. He figured that was what was driving Ellie too. How are you holding up? Hector asked. I'm doing okay, Ellie said. I still feel sick, but the medicine helps a lot. My legs are still jelly too and everything itches. It's nothing I can't handle though. That didn't sound like she was doing okay, and Hector said as much. I think we have different ideas about what okay is. It's fine, really, Ellie replied. Now that I'm not throwing up every 5 minutes, it's way better. I'm just tired and sore. Hopefully the break will help then. The two of them continued to sit there on the ruined roadside talking for a while. It was just idle chatter, talking about athleticism, or the lack thereof, and the threat of rain. Neither Hector nor Ellie pressed any more serious topics for the moment. It was a brief but welcome reprieve. Up until then, they had talked almost solely about their goal of reaching the hospital and how best to achieve it. Spending some time on small talk was just as reinvigorating as the short rest they were taking, maybe even more so. It was as the two of them chatted that the rain began to fall at last. Droplets splashed down on Hector's skin, but they felt thick and heavy. The feeling alerted him to something being off before his eyes did. Hector looked down and saw the rain falling onto him was not clear droplets, but globs of something sticky and black. The gears in Hector's mind turned as he stared at the gluggy rain. It definitely wasn't normal. That much was certain. We have to get inside, now! It was Ellie that shouted, not Hector. She leapt to her feet with such a sudden surge of energy and vigor that it could only be attributed to adrenaline. What's happening? Hector asked, also jumping to his feet. His heart started hammering in a syncopated rhythm in response to Ellie's very visible alarm. Just move! She yelled again, and took off at the fastest run she could for the nearest building. Hector wasn't arguing with that tone. He immediately followed after her. They sprinted through a downpour of tar-like sludge, being pelted by droplets of water and residue in equal measure. Had their clothes not been dark in color, they would undoubtedly have been stained black. Hector followed behind Ellie as she made a beeline for the nearest building. It was in relatively good condition. Its windows were blown out, but only a segment in its back corner had really crumbled in on itself. They rushed in through one of the missing windows. Hector hadn't noticed the nature of the establishment while running, but now that he was inside, he realized they were in a gym. Most of the equipment was still standing. This is perfect, Ellie said, chest heaving from the brief run. Why is it perfect? Hector asked, confused. Gyms have showers. Strip. What? Hector was confused by the command. Was she really that bothered by them being covered in dirt? What was he missing? To Hector's alarm, Ellie was already pulling off her jacket and tossing it aside before he had finished formulating the thought. Wait! He yelped. Ellie, what the hell is going on? The rain is radioactive! Hector felt a shiver run down his body that had very little to do with the winter weather. That was enough for him. Modesty forgotten, replaced entirely with raw panic, Hector was quick to follow Ellie's lead and started tearing off his clothes. He had barely removed the last article when Ellie had grabbed his wrist and started pulling him along. He hardly had time to reach out and grab the strap of their bag to take it with him. She dragged him toward the back of the gym where a corner of the building had caved in through a doorway into a tiled change room. Ellie let go of Hector's wrist. She made for the back of the room where a row of shower stalls lined the wall and disappeared into one. Hector followed behind and pushed his way into the adjacent stall. For a moment, he was worried that the water wouldn't work. The corner that had been knocked in was probably the other change room. It could have messed with the water. No sooner had he had the thought, though, that he heard running water to his left. With a sigh of relief, he turned on his own taps and stepped under the water. It was lukewarm at best, but he figured he shouldn't complain since it may well have been saving his life. Once he had been under the spray for a few moments, he rinsed the bag off. He figured that, since it was waterproof, its contents were probably safe from the polluted rain. Sorry, I should have explained first. That probably felt really weird. Ellie's voice came through the other stall, echoing slightly. There she went apologizing again. It's fine, Hector said. Can you explain now, though? How did you know? I just put the pieces together, Ellie replied. When the bomb went off, it probably blew a bunch of stuff into the sky. Nukes make mushroom clouds, right? Right. The obviousness of the situation was now dawning on Hector. He hadn't exactly had a desire to stand out in weird sloppy rain, but how long would he have stood there, curious and confused, without Ellie's quick thinking? How long would he have remained in place, getting slowly irradiated? Well, all that stuff was probably radioactive, and what goes up must come down. Hector felt a strong surge of gratitude. He had no idea how much radiation was in the rain, or how much it would have taken to kill either of them. As far as he was concerned, though, Ellie's quick thinking and simple logic had just saved both their lives. "Thanks," Hector said. "You probably just kept both of us alive." "What can I say? I like being alive," Ellie joked, echoing Hector's words from earlier in the day. Hector chortled, his faint laughter barely audible over the sound of the water. It was surreal to realize he had said those same words only hours prior. It felt like he'd been with Ellie for days. It was already becoming hard not to imagine having her present. He had heard that tragedy brought people together before, but he'd never thought twice about it. Now he was experiencing that firsthand. "Hey, Ellie," he began, only to be cut off by a sudden exclamation. "Oh no!" "What's wrong?" Hector asked, his state of alarm spiking immediately. "Nothing to panic about," Ellie said. "My nose just started bleeding." Difficulty walking? Vomiting? Now a nosebleed? What god had Ellie angered? Or rather, just what had happened when Ellie's house had been hit during the bombing? "Pinch your nose for 10 minutes and tilt your head forward, not back," Hector said, remembering what his mother had taught him. "If you tilt it back, it'll just run down your throat." "Okay," Ellie replied, her voice already distorted slightly from her nose being sealed off. Hector stepped out of the shower spray for a moment and opened their bag. Sure enough, the contents within were dry. He pulled out a towel and slung it over the divide between them. "For when you're done. Try not to bleed on it. How long do you think we need to be in here, anyway?" Ellie didn't respond. "Ellie?" Hector prompted. "Sorry, what was that? I missed it." Was this the same girl who'd been quick enough on the uptake a moment ago to realize the rain was radioactive in an instant? "Are you sure you're okay, Ellie?" "Yeah, I just got really dizzy all of a sudden. It's probably just the nosebleed, though, right?" "I don't know," Hector said. "I guess it could be blood loss, but it seems too early for that." "Oh," Ellie's voice sounded weak and sleepy. "Actually, I think I need to sit down." The statement was punctuated by the sound of flesh slapping down on tiles, as though someone had just fallen over or sat down way too fast. "Ellie?" When no response came again, Hector thrust his hand into their bag and yanked out the other towel. He wrapped it around his waist as he slammed his way out of the stall. He rounded on Ellie's own booth and ripped it open. She was kneeling, doubled over herself with one hand still pinching her nose and the other resting on the ground as she gasped for air, hyperventilating. Whether it was out of panic or because she was struggling to breathe, Hector didn't know. He knew it wasn't good, though. He felt the rate of his own breathing pick up as his adrenaline spiked and fear clawed at him from within. He had to help her, but what could he do? "Slow your breathing down," Hector instructed, struggling to follow his own advice. "In, then hold, then out." Despite being in the grip of his own terror, Hector tried to lead by example. "In," he breathed in. He held his breath for a moment, then he exhaled. "Out." Ellie nodded, trying to do as she was instructed. Her breaths slowed slightly. Then suddenly they picked up very abruptly. She was panting heavier than ever before. Her body shuddered and she scrambled forward. There was an awful, repulsive noise as she vomited up a sickening mix of bile and blood. The look of terror etched into her face grew more wild, and Hector knew it was a reflection of his own. He would have to be calm, though, at least in appearance. She had just saved them, and now he would do what he could to help her in return. Even as fearful tears streamed down Ellie's face and she sobbed through ragged, shallow breaths, Hector knelt by her side and held her hair back out the way. He felt her shaking like a phone on vibrate, and he felt a convulsion as she threw up more of the bloody mixture. "Stay calm," Hector said. "Keep breathing nice and slow, just like me." What else was he supposed to do? What else could he do? Hector wanted to tell her everything was okay. He wanted to believe that was the case himself. But this wasn't okay. This was terrifying. It was turning his blood to ice. He had to say something, though. "I know nothing is good about this," Hector started speaking, fumbling for words and just letting them tumble out of his mouth as he arrived at them. He couldn't do anything about her puking up blood. But he could try to do something about the panic that was undoubtedly making the experience worse. "This isn't right or fair, and it's not okay right now. I promise, though, you'll get through this. We'll get you to the hospital tomorrow. Things will get better. You will get better. Just keep up that breathing. Hector felt Ellie clench up as she threw up yet more blood. Despite this, though, she kept fighting to slow down her breathing. He watched her struggling to control her sobbing. Eventually, she slumped slightly, losing the tension in her body. Her breaths slowed down to a more normal pace. She dry-retched a few times, sprinkling more droplets of blood onto the tiles. She still shook with fear, and still sobbed intermittently. Hector wanted to cry himself. He felt so helpless, so useless. Perhaps if George had been there in his place, he would have known what to do. At the very least, he could have carried Ellie and they would have been closer to the hospital. But Hector was not George. He never would be. Despite his frustration, fear, and grief, though, Hector did not shed a tear. He couldn't allow himself to. It wasn't about pride. It was for Ellie. She needed to see that he believed things would work out and that she was safe. Even if Hector felt neither of those things were true at that moment, she needed to see that he did. The illusion of calmness and confidence was all that he could give her. Once the heaving and gagging had subsided and Ellie's breathing felt more stable, Hector let her hair fall back down. He sidled around the crumpled stall as best he could to turn off the taps. Then he grabbed the towel he had slung over the divide between the showers and draped it around her as best he could. "I'm going to go turn the other shower off and dry off," he said. "You should get dry and wrap yourself up properly, too. I'll be right there if you need me. Let me know when you're ready for me to come back." "Okay," Ellie replied weakly. Hector left the stall, shutting the door behind him, and returned to his own to shut off the water and towel himself off. Without the running showers, the room was suddenly silent again, but for the sound of his and Ellie's carefully measured breathing, and the rain still falling heavily on the roof above. The minutes that went by in that quiet time felt painfully long to Hector. He desperately wanted to rush back to Ellie and confirm she was okay. His thoughts were still running wild with nightmare scenarios of returning to find her lifeless. It was now all too clear that something was very wrong with her. This wasn't just the result of a concussion or from being battered around too hard. He couldn't hurry, though. For Ellie's sake, he had to keep up the appearance that he wasn't concerned. For his own, he wanted to pretend he didn't need to be. Besides, with the immediate danger seeming to have passed, he did want to preserve some semblance of her privacy. After a while, Ellie's shaking voice called out to him. "It's okay. You can come back now." Apprehensively, Hector moved back to the other cubicle. He found Ellie still kneeling, but sitting in a more upright position. She had wrapped the towel more properly around herself. It was stained with fresh blood from where she had wiped her face as clean as she could, but her nose wasn't bleeding anymore. She looked exhausted, sickly, and pallid. At the very least, though, she had made it through for the time being. "That was unpleasant." She smiled feebly, but her shoulders shook with the ghost of a laugh. Hector forced himself to smile back. "I don't know what you're talking about. I felt fine." Hector bent down to Ellie and scooped her up in a bridal carry, careful to avoid the burns on her unbandaged arm. He ignored the blazing pain the action ignited in his joints. He was glad that she was small because he definitely couldn't carry her for long. "What are you doing?" Ellie yelped in surprise. "It's quicker than walking with you leaning all over me. Just don't expect to be carried all the way to the hospital in the morning." "Thank you." "It's nothing," Hector lied, his arms protesting his decision. With difficulty, Hector carried Ellie out and across the main part of the gym. He placed her down behind the counter as gently as he could, where the cold winter wind blowing through the empty window panes was blocked. There was a door behind the front desk. Hector tried the handle and was pleased to find it unlocked. He opened it to reveal a small office beyond. It was occupied only by a desk with an old computer on it and a bunch of filing cabinets against the wall. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would keep them out of the elements. "We'll have to stay here tonight," Hector said. "So let's do our best to stay warm in the office. I am seriously starting to regret not finding clothes to add to our supplies." "You thought to get towels and that blanket, though," Ellie said. "It's not like you knew literal nuclear fallout was going to rain down on us." "I guess." Hector helped Ellie back to her feet and supported her as she hobbled into the room. Once she was settled down into the corner, facing the door, he remembered that he had left their supplies behind in the change room. "I'll be right back." Ellie nodded and Hector headed back to the change room, returning moments later with their bag. "Good thing this was waterproof," he said, re-entering the room and shutting the door behind him. Hector carefully made his way through the darkness and sat down next to Ellie. Reaching into their bag, he pulled out the blanket he had taken earlier. He shuffled closer and threw it over them. "Sorry about being so close, but it's better than freezing to death." "I don't mind," Ellie said, leaning against him. Hector was surprised to find that her skin felt quite warm against his own. If the shower water had been hotter than a river during autumn, he might not have found it odd. As it were, though, it was obvious she had a temperature. "At least your fever will help keep me warm," Hector joked, realizing a little too late that she might not have known she was burning up. "You're welcome," Ellie replied smugly, either knowing already or not being surprised by the information. Hector reached into their bag again and retrieved one of their water bottles. He handed it to Ellie as he reached for the one that he had been using himself. "Remember, you have to keep hydrated. We can refill them with the water here before we leave." Ellie took a minuscule sip of the liquid and then handed the bottle back to Hector. He couldn't blame her for not wanting to put much of anything into her body after what had just happened. It would have to do. After that, they didn't speak for a while. Instead, Hector simply listened to Ellie's breathing. Every now and then it would spike and she would abruptly straighten up, and together they'd resume their breathing exercises. Intermittently, Hector would search the office. He was hoping to come across more medical supplies, something to get Ellie's temperature down, perhaps. It seemed to him this would be the place to find such things in the gym, but he never did. He considered checking the change room again, but he hadn't seen any sign of a first aid kit in there before and doubted that would change. Besides, he didn't want to leave Ellie. He was worried about her. Sometimes Ellie would make a sound as though she was about to speak, but no words would ever follow. Hector couldn't help but wonder what it was she was struggling to get out. Given their current predicament, he couldn't imagine it would be anything much worse. Inside, it had now darkened to a point where it was becoming difficult to see. Even accounting for the clouds, smoke, and ash, it seemed likely that it was at the very least in the early stages of evening. As the time passed, Ellie was still trying but failing to speak. After she started again for what felt like the millionth time, Hector decided it was time that they bridge that gap. "You've been acting like you want to say something for, I think, hours now. What is it?" He felt Ellie's breath hitch and heard a deep exhalation as she breathed out. She took her time, taking several deep breaths to steady herself. It was the same thing they had been doing together every time she felt a wave of pain or sickness. However, there had been no mention of another spike in her suffering. "Did you see?" she finally asked. See what? He had made every effort not to see anything he wasn't supposed to, and he had been too busy panicking for his eyes to linger anyway. He was about to say as much when Ellie continued. "On my back, I mean." On her back? Any awkwardness or embarrassment Hector had been feeling was suddenly replaced with confusion. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Ellie's breath hitched again, and he felt her shaking intensify. Hector couldn't really fathom what could be on her back that would warrant this much anxiety. Did she have some sort of scar or birthmark or silly thing like that she was embarrassed about? "I didn't see anything," Hector replied. "Don't worry about it." "Maybe you should," Ellie said again. "I'm sorry, Hector. I've not been honest with you, and you're taking such good care of me. I feel like I owe you the truth." Nothing Ellie said made any sense to Hector. She was lying about something on her back? What truth could she possibly owe him that would be marked on her skin? Was this the secret to her illness, or was she just descending into delirium? "I don't understand." "Look." Ellie leaned forwards and pulled her hair out of the way to reveal her upper back. "They had to put it somewhere it wouldn't be seen." "Put what? Who?" The questions had already started burbling out Hector's mouth in a fountain of confusion before he even realized what he was supposed to be looking at. He leaned forward, straining his eyes against the darkness. It was incredibly hard to see, but Hector could just barely make out a mark. Sitting between Ellie's shoulder blades was a simple, dark ink marking. Hector's bewilderment only grew. The tiny marking seemed to be a tattoo. Why would that be something so important? Why worry about him seeing it? What kind of girl her age had a tattoo to begin with? It was as Hector continued to stare at the marking engraved on Ellie's skin through the darkness that a wave of horrific understanding began to crush him under its weight. He felt a horrible lump forming in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was looking at. He didn't want to believe what was in front of him. The tattoo resembled a U or a horseshoe, but it got thinner at its ends before branching out into thicker prongs. An inverted omega. There wasn't a person alive in Kudin, in all of Ionia, that wasn't familiar with that symbol. Hector himself had seen it in the news numerous times. It was the logo of the liberation movement. Hector felt disoriented. It was like he had physically taken a powerful blow to his head. It was as though the world around him was spinning. Why is that on your back? Who are you? What's going on, Ellie? To Hector's surprise, he was suddenly aware that Ellie was not silent. He could hear her crying. It was my parents, she managed to choke out. My parents set off the nuke. They drove it into the middle of the city and blew themselves up. Hector was speechless. He could only sit there and listen to Ellie's sobbing. How could what he was hearing be real? How could the universe be cruel enough to have him bond with someone who was a part of the group responsible for taking away everything? He had been helping her. It was because of him that one of them was still alive. Rage began to boil up in Hector like magma, and much like a volcano, he could feel it was about to erupt. He felt far more sick to his stomach at that moment than he had during any of the previous hours. In that instant, for the first time, it was Hector who was shaking the most. But his tremors did not come from fear or feebleness. They came from fury. He shoved Ellie out of the way and stood up, letting the blanket drop. He was already stomping off before he even knew where he was going. He threw open the door and stormed past the front counter. He had no destination in mind. He just had to be away. He had to be far away from Ellie. She was a poison. Hector, don't! You'll freeze to death out there! Ellie called after him. Then I'll find my clothes. Then you'll die of radiation instead! Maybe I don't care anymore! Hector yelled. Maybe I want to be with all the others you people have killed. What does it even matter to you if one more person dies because of you? I didn't want this, Ellie whimpered, the strength in her voice fading away. Hector ignored her and kept walking towards the window they had entered through. He heard Ellie staggering to her feet behind him. He heard her taking shaky steps towards him. He kept moving. Please don't leave me too! Hector wasn't sure why that did it, but he turned around. Through the murky darkness, he could just barely see Ellie standing at the edge of the counter, leaning against it. She lacked the strength to chase him any further. He watched her double over, gagging, but she swallowed it down and kept shuffling forwards. I know I don't have the right to say that, she begged. But please, I'm scared, Hector. I'm so sick I feel like I'm dying. Everyone else left me. You're the only one who chose to stay. Please don't leave me alone. They stood there, staring at each other. Hector couldn't see her face, but in his mind's eye he could picture the look of desperation and pain it was carrying. He had seen her wearing a very similar expression before, and only now was he really understanding what it had meant. At least, if one of us is going to go out there and drop dead, she pleaded, let it be me. You won't have to be guilty. I deserve it. Then I wouldn't have to be alone and you'd still be safe in here. Hector felt as though something sharp was piercing his chest, as though a monster was rending him apart from the inside. There was too much anger, too much pain and confusion. He was feeling more than he could handle. He screamed. It was a wordless howl. Intense emotions Hector couldn't contain just exploded out of him. Hector? Ellie yelped in alarm. She started to rush towards him, but no sooner had she taken a few steps away from the counter had she doubled over again. The darkness was pierced by the nightmarish sound of her undoubtedly spewing up more blood. Hector turned and hurried back towards her. How could he blame her for things she never did? He had felt like the victim. He was a victim, but nobody had been hurt more than Ellie. She had lost everything that he had, maybe more. But her family had left her by choice and took an entire city with them. At last, Hector understood the burden she was carrying that led her to apologize all the time, even when no apologies were needed. He reached her quickly, reaching out and pulling her hair back for her just as he had before. She vomited again. He heard the sickening sound and the splash on the floor. He didn't shy away, though. He had made his choice. It's okay, Hector said. I promise I won't leave you. He was nearly knocked off his feet as she threw herself into his arms, but he held her there in the dark until her crying had started to subside. Then, carefully, he led her back into the office and helped her lay back down against the wall before pulling the blanket over them. I'm sorry, Hector said. You didn't deserve that. I'm not going to make excuses for it. Ellie nestled back against him as she had before, sharing her warmth with him. It's okay. I understand. It's not okay. You're as much a victim as me. More so. You don't deserve to be treated like that for someone else's actions. You shouldn't feel that kind of guilt. If anyone should know that it's wrong to base your expectations of one person on another, it's me. Thank you, Ellie said. Then she surprised Hector. Can I tell you what happened?